All right, guys. It seems like it's 6:35, so probably this all the people that are gonna come. Can everyone hear me? Well, great, perfect. All right, so I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Emma Ciccini. I'm one of the ambassadors for UNC Journey. Um,
Hey guys, hey everyone, my name's Siobhan Concharla and I'm one of the natural science editors for Journey.
I just wanted to say firsthand that we really want this workshop to be more like a collaborative um workshop. So when we ask questions, like feel free to answer each other's questions and we can like talk openly about things. We could talk out loud, talk using the chat. So when there's gonna be moments where we're gonna ask you guys questions and hopefully some of you guys, if you feel comfortable, can participate and make this process a little less awkward sometimes because Zoom can be awkward silences. So let's try not to do that. All right, so this workshop is talking about how to give and receive feedback during the research process. So first we wanted to introduce UNC Journey. So who are we? The Journey editorial board is completely student run. We're a group of undergraduate students from all different backgrounds. So there's a lot of STEM people, but there's also a lot of humanities, like I'm an anthropology and global studies major. So we have editors who review and select papers for the annual journal. We collaborate with accepted authors to polish and prepare their work for publications. And we also host workshops like this on various skills that are central to guide you through the research process. So, what is the purpose for this workshop? The main purpose is to strengthen feedback culture and collaboration. So, giving and receiving feedback may seem like a basic skill, right? We've been doing this since for as long as we can remember, but mastering it is essential for conducting efficient research and ensuring high quality publications. A strong feedback culture not only improves the research process, but also maximizes the impact of the final work. So when would you give or gain scientific feedback? So some ways we can give scientific feedback is, so we have a list that we came up with. So there's peer review when reviewing research papers, proposals, or grant applications, collaborations, providing input on colleagues' work in a research team or lab setting, conferences and seminars. This is one of the reasons why people go to conferences to give and receive feedback. So giving constructive feedback after a presentation or discussion, learning from one another. Teaching and mentoring, guiding students or junior researchers on the methodologies and findings, publication revisions, responding to or suggesting improvements on submitted manuscripts, and grant proposals, offering insight to improve funding applications. So when would you gain scientific feedback? So whenever you submit to journals, like if you submit to our journal, receiving peer review and editor comments for improvements, presenting research, so getting feedback from peers at conferences, workshops, or seminars, lab meetings, discussing experimental design and results with colleagues, collaborative research, gaining insight from co-researchers to refine experiments or theories, advisory or thesis committee reviews, receiving input from experts to enhance dissertation research, online academic communities, engaging in discussions or seeking feedback in forums like ResearchGate or academic and social networks. So I wanted to open up the floor if anyone has any other times when you can give or receive feedback that we may have missed. If I'm going to give like 30 seconds, if you want to put it in the chat or just say it out loud, if you can think of anything that we missed. So just ideas about when to give feedback or ideas of when you can gain feedback. before submitting a project for a course. That's a great example. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about the importance of scientific feedback. So, we probably all know what feedback is, and we've probably given it in some form, whether that's for a class or if we've kind of done like a peer review for maybe your English class per se. But for this presentation, we really want to hone in on the importance of scientific feedback and what that might look like in a peer review process. So, the first thing we should probably talk about is why feedback matters in research. And so, feedback allows scientists to objectively establish accurate findings and maintain a standard in quality of papers. So, what does it mean by accurate findings? Well, you would actually be surprised how many papers actually write inaccurate results. And or they exaggerate maybe the findings of their papers. And so this can be for a lot of different reasons. It could be because maybe a lab has a specific quota of papers that they kind of have to push out. And so sometimes, the quality of a paper might be lacking. And so that's why we need to make sure that there is, proper feedback so that way we can ensure that all the research that are getting published have accurate findings that actually reflect their experiment. And also when we're talking about quality of papers, that can mean a lot of things as well. So that's referring to, simple things like grammar and syntax. It could also refer to the flow of information. And so, feedback can also, through rigorous evaluation, can also help present the paper in a more efficient and impactful manner. So what I mean by efficient and impactful manner is, research papers are oftentimes discussing some pretty complex ideas. And so the goal of a research project is generally to put some sort of experiment, identify the results of those, and then hopefully in the future, others build off of that research to maybe create some sort of tangible impact. And so the issue comes is, well, if we have a paper that, we can't really understand, or maybe is written in such a way that it's confusing for others to build off of, then that can kind of reduce the actual impact of the paper. One example of that is, a good characteristic of a research paper is being able to reproduce it. So meaning that you're able to do it multiple times and you should ideally get the same results. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to maybe replicate a research paper that I was reading up on, but I'm not able to do so because maybe their methodology is missing a lot of important details. So that could be a sign that maybe there wasn't enough feedback on the methodology section to say, hey, maybe there are a lot of gaps in your methodology that we can include to make it so that we can reproduce those experiments by other people. So another thing we want to talk about is the difference between feedback versus criticism. They're very similar, but the main difference between feedback is that it not only addresses a potential issue, but it has a higher emphasis on the solution to that issue. And that's something that we'll kind of see a little bit more when we actually start talking about, some examples of effective feedback. So before I start getting into, what is effective feedback, I want to first kind of talk about or kind of address maybe some of the ways we're used to traditionally giving feedback. That could be either just kind of putting words together on a Google Doc on a comment and just sending it, or, you might follow this traditional feedback sandwich where you kind of start with something positive, then, kind of give a negative feedback in the middle and then end with another positive feedback. But truthfully, so these are not really that great methods to use in the professional setting. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, we don't necessarily have this entire massive time scale in order to be giving kind of a lot of extra fluff in terms of the positive and the negative, right? We're working in a professional setting where these are principal investigators, these might be lab managers, directors, and so they're pretty thick skinned when it comes to receiving and giving feedback. I mean, this is a pretty big part of their career. And so um, it's kind of inefficient on both our time as maybe giving the feedback, and then also on their time actually reading that feedback to kind of say, oh, like these are all the great things that we did in the paper, but here's the negative, right? And so it's usually a lot better to just go straight to kind of the gaps of the paper. And so really what I'm trying to say here is that you can use positive feedback or kind of incorporate it throughout, but don't feel like you are forced to kind of stick to this cookie cutter feedback sandwich. And so you can still present feedback in a nice and professional way without having to stick to that method. And so some of the key principles of giving effective feedback is number one, be specific. Focus on clear, actionable points that are related directly to the text. And below that, I gave a kind of example. So rather than saying, this sentence is vague, you can say, this sentence about potassium pumps should specify whether it's hydrophobic or hydrophilic. So you can see how instead of just mentioning it as vague, we really kind of include the key words. So that way the person who's making the changes can really properly identify what needs to be changed or what the feedback is referring to. Just kind of as a personal example, when I was writing a paper for Carolina Scientific and I was interviewing a professor on their research, part of that process is the professor goes back through your paper and gives feedback on it. And one of the feedbacks that I got was, this is completely wrong, in all caps. And I'm not kidding. That's literally what was one of the comments. And so, great. I know that that sentence is wrong, but I don't really know much else, right? I don't know what parts of the sentence were wrong. Maybe was it, if there was multiple elements in that sentence, was it the first part that was wrong or the second part, right? And that poses some risk because maybe I'm going to start changing something that was right in the first place. And so it's super important that we be specific in the feedback that we give. Two is to highlight the problem and the potential solution. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about between the difference between feedback and criticism. Feedback really kind of puts that emphasis on actually finding a solution. And so, it might seem like it takes extra time to actually provide a solution as well. But as we'll talk about later, when we start actually looking at the peer review process, taking the time to really think of potential solutions on your own in that feedback is going to be super helpful. So the third thing, again, is to maintain professionalism. I know I kind of talked about, we don't really need to use this feedback sandwich, but that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't be promoting a kind of positive and encouraging environment. These are your coworkers and not your little brother, right? So, we want to make sure that we're in a positive environment. And so something that I wanted to ask you guys is, what are maybe some ways that we can maintain professionalism without necessarily sugarcoating a paper, right? So instead of saying, oh, we did XYZ good, what are some other ways that maybe we can maintain professionalism? So if you would like to share that in the chat, or just, if you want to unmute and say that, let's see what you guys think.
So one person said to start with a compliment, then list out potential corrections.
That's definitely a good one. Yeah. You can start with a compliment, but just, don't feel like you have to necessarily apply that for every single feedback, right? Because these are people, if you're working, let's say in like a lab, right? You're working with maybe a principal investigator, or maybe a lab manager. These guys have been giving and getting feedback for as long as possible, right? So they have a lot of experience. And so just be cautious in that, sometimes you don't want to give, not to say that you shouldn't give too many compliments, but sometimes it can come off as a little fluff and a little bit of sugarcoating, right? So, but again, start with a compliment, then list potential corrections. Definitely a viable one.
And especially like a lot of times when people start with a compliment, they say, oh, this was really good, but X, Y, and Z. And a lot of times when you use but, it just means that everything before the but wasn't really true. So, I mean,
Exactly.
everyone loves compliments and hearing what they did right. And I definitely encourage you guys to say what you did think was good, but yeah, just putting that out there. All right, another in the chat, someone said using professional language and don't critique too hard. Also utilizing relatability. I really like that, especially like professional language. Sometimes when I'm like here editing like my friends' papers just like for fun, like I would use like, oh, not good, exclamation point, whatever, that's not good feedback, right? That's not professional. Whenever you're giving real feedback, you want to use professional language. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of goes on a little bit to the next point, the don't critique too hard, right? Is
Mhm.
sometimes I guess once we start nitpicking one thing, we start kind of breaking the entire, sentence apart. But the really, what should really be the focus is on that specific instance that you're trying to give that feedback on, of a wider
Okay,
audience
so
instead of a personal opinion. Yeah, that's definitely, yeah, for sure. In the workplace in general, right? You don't really want to get necessarily your personal opinions to get kind of cloud your judgment. And so definitely kind of taking a more third person objective viewpoint and kind of tying it back to what is our collective goal. Is it, if we're trying to get a publication, that should be our main focus and not kind of let personal judgment cloud that.
for
But
sure. Yeah.
two, so those are definitely some great examples. Two of the things that I was going to mention is one, definitely, I think one way to show professionalism or show a positive environment is to just, or is to kind of take your time, I think, in the feedback that you give. I think for example, when I see someone giving me feedback and not only identifying but maybe what could be a potential gap, but taking the time to actually list out potential solutions or changes, it really kind of shows to me that they care. They might not necessarily include extra details like, oh, I thought this was great, or they might not include some of that sugarcoating, but I still have that sense that this person genuinely cares about my work because they took that extra time in order to give effective feedback. And another thing that you could do again, a lot of this kind of comes down to the small details, but traditionally in research, you're probably working with a group, right? Working with colleagues. It's usually not an independent thing, and so sometimes something as simple as using a collective pronouns rather than a singular one. So saying, "Hey, I think we should change this section," rather than "Hey, I think you should change this section." It really kind of shows that even though maybe that assignment was kind of assigned to a singular person, it kind of still ties it back in that this is a collective effort. So,
Yeah,
those are
that's a
definitely some
great
great things.
example.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you everyone for responding.
yeah, exactly. And we kind of touched on the be relevant, right? Making sure that we're not kind of bringing in other external aspects that might not necessarily be related to what we're directly giving feedback about. So, we're gonna now move on to one of our activities that kind of ties in or kind of builds off of the previous slide when we talked about effective feedback. So in this slide, we have a sample paper or kind of an excerpt of a paper per se, and we gave some feedback on the right. If you're when you're reading this, you can probably tell they're pretty bad feedback, and so the goal of this activity is to kind of using some of the points that we mentioned in the previous slide, how can we make this better, right? How can we make this into effective feedback, like you would if maybe you were working in a lab, or maybe if you were working on an actual project. And so we're going to take 5 minutes. If you want to write them out in the chat, perfect. And then maybe after 5 minutes, we can kind of reconvene and read through some of them and kind of discuss on maybe some examples of how we could actually phrase them.
Okay, so I feel like hopefully you guys had some time to read through and like look at the feedback that was given, which we don't feel like it's good feedback. So let's talk about ways that we can give better feedback. So let's see what you guys wrote.
Yeah, so I think one of the, common things that I'm seeing is that, obviously these feedback are not specific, right? They're really vague. And so, that's kind of the core here of effective feedback is not just saying what the issue is, but really taking that extra time to highlight, what the potential solutions are. And so for the first one, a lot of people said, you know, we should be more specific in what they're clarifying, right? So maybe clarifying, what method was used in the previous study, or clarifying um, what parts of that method did they change up, right? So any of those, which I think a lot of people mention, would be totally correct answers. And so, um, someone said for the yellow section, ask them to clarify how the results were different than they expected. Exactly, yeah. So just being more specific, and not being vague in terms of what feedback we're giving. Um, I think that pretty much covers, the core of that activity, was that specificity. So we can move on to this part.
All right, so for receiving feedback, so here's a couple of steps that you can take. So first, visualize how you will receive the feedback, right? So kind of mentally prepare, because sometimes, or actually all the time, whenever you give somebody your paper asking for feedback, you put a lot of thought, time, effort into this paper. Normally you send it thinking this is like my best work. I want to know what they think. And then a lot of times you get it back and there's a lot of feedback that you didn't expect. So you should prepare for that, right? So next step is to stay open to the feedback given. So a lot of times, especially when we work really, really hard on our papers, we kind of are very narrow-minded and just kind of, put blinders on and only see, tunnel vision a little bit. And so when we get feedback that we weren't expecting, it could come as a shock and it can be like, oh no, like I don't agree with this at all. Like you don't see my vision. But in reality, you need to step back. You need to step out of your comfort zone and like be open to what your peer is saying. So if you don't understand, you should seek clarification. Um, if someone is giving you feedback, if they're spending time out of their day to give you feedback, they would gladly further explain what they were talking about. A lot of times, if it's, if they just send notes on your paper, they maybe couldn't elaborate as much as they wanted to unless you go and speak to them in person or, so definitely clarify, seek clarification. The fourth step is to be appreciative. Say thank you to the person giving feedback. Even if you don't agree with what they said, even if you don't like what they're telling you to do, this is an essential part of the process. It's part of the process that you should never skip. When people give you feedback and when they read your papers, it's a time out of their day that they did not have to, or that they were willing to give you. And they put work and effort into it and care. So you should be appreciative. So identify what you can learn from the feedback. So even if you don't agree with everything, they made these comments for a reason. And you should try to, take something out of each comment. The sixth step is to set up an action plan with milestones and timelines. So, receiving feedback on a paper and having, so many comments and so many things to change, especially whenever you're really proud of the work that you put in. This can be really difficult sometimes to like get started, right? A lot of times we have to cut things, have to change things, maybe things that you don't want to cut, things that you're really attached to, things that you worked really hard on. So setting up a plan, maybe doing things in chunks and small parts, sitting down and just making a plan on how to uh make these changes will help. And the last step is to be clear about what you believe you cannot accomplish. So if the feedback is too much, or if it'll completely derail your experiment and your every whatever it is, you should be honest with yourself and adjust. So is there any questions on that? All right, so how to receive feedback. So this is very important. So always appreciate feedback given regardless of whether you agree or disagree. So it takes a lot of time to provide feedback, like I mentioned previously. So ask clarifying questions. If something is unclear, politely ask for more explanations, right? We just talked about that. So taking the initiative to gain feedback is always important, regardless of how confident or proficient you might be at something. So you can ask a colleague to review a write-up you wrote, consult with a principal investigator or senior member for advice, feedback on a project assignment, or you can ask a professor or a peer to give feedback if that's allowed. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So kind of building off of that, what if you disagree with feedback, right? Because that happens. You've probably been given feedback on maybe one of your English papers, and you're like, I don't really know if I agree with that or if I want to make that change. And so that happens a lot, exactly with scientific research. And so what do you do? Well, one of the things that you could do is check the credibility of who is giving you feedback, right? For example, let's say you're working in a lab with other undergraduate students and you were given an assignment. And so, let's say another undergraduate student gave you feedback on a write up that you wrote. And let's say you don't agree with them, right? Well, this person probably has a relatively similar amount of credibility as you do, right? They probably have similar experience when it comes to maybe the subject that you do, and so it might be a little bit more warranted to say, hey, maybe I should seek the perspective of someone else, maybe the lab PI or maybe the lab manager, right? But let's say if that feedback is coming uh, from a PI directly, then they probably have a credibility to that project, and they probably have a lot more experience in that aspect. And so that's when you can kind of ask yourself if maybe you should be asking extra clarification questions, or maybe you should be seeking multiple perspectives. And so when we're talking about multiple perspectives, if let's say you have a disagreement in terms of feedback, get another colleague to look through that paper, right, and see if that feedback is paralleled among all of them. And if there's a trend that kind of emerges, then maybe you can say, okay, maybe this is something that I just didn't notice, right? And so the third point, always ask questions and have discussions on that feedback, right? Especially as undergraduate students, if we're interested in getting in research, we're going to be hitting points where you might not always understand something, or you're given feedback and you're not exactly sure what to do with it, or maybe how to take the next step from that, right? And it's always important that you ask questions, have an open conversation with whoever is giving you that feedback to not only understand their kind of thought process behind it, but how you can better implement it, right? So, you know, don't feel afraid to ask a PI or a teacher or a colleague to give further clarification, to explain a little bit more. And that actually might help you out long term, because especially when you're just starting off and maybe you don't have enough experience, you might not immediately observe some of these more minute details, that, hey, maybe this should be worded a different way, or hey, I should maybe write it in XYZ format, right? And so it's important that you ask questions that down the road you kind of develop that eye in order to notice some of those more minute details. And so, everything kind of comes up to this slide and kind of talking about scientific research in the peer review process, right? So let's kind of start at point one and work our way to, the kind of final goal, I guess you could say, for the research projects, which is publication, right? So let's first start with manuscript submission, right? So let's say, I'm interested in orthopedics. So let's just say I wrote a project on in some sort of development in some orthopedic related subject, right? And I have my paper, like a rough draft ready to go. The very first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to find some journals that kind of align with what my project is on that I can publish in. And so that's where we're going to have the manuscript submission. So I'm going to send a kind of rough draft that fits all of their specific format guidelines. So kind of each each paper might have kind of specific guidelines in terms of how they want things cited, how they kind of want their figures to have their descriptions. There's so many different specific formats that each paper kind of nitpicks. And so that's kind of where you put that manuscript together and then submit it. Two, you're going to have the editorial assessment by a peer review process. So each journal will kind of have a elected group of individuals who will review your paper, who are pretty much experts in their field when it comes to this subject. And so they're going to give you, that's kind of the point where they will look at your results, see if it makes sense based off of the experiment that you ran, and then they will give additional feedback in terms of the flow of the paper, right? We kind of talked about example as maybe your methodology could use a little bit more work, or maybe you should kind of reorganize the flow of some of the paragraphs, right? So those will be kind of feedback that they'll give. And so then it comes back to you, and then you make those revisions, right? So that's getting that feedback and then making those changes to your manuscript. And then you resubmit it, and it's basically just a back and forth of the same process that occurs until you finally get to the proofreading and final edit stage, and you're finally hopefully ready for publication once all of those changes are made. And so the kind of key point that I'm trying to drive here is that feedback is a crucial part of any step related to the peer review process. So if you're interested at any point in your undergraduate career of getting involved in research, you're going to have to start developing your feedback skills, and also develop how you take feedback and make changes off of that. And so at the bottom here again is kind of that cycle, kind of showing how it goes back and forth between authors and editors, how we go from gaining feedback and giving feedback, right? So editors are going to be the ones providing the feedback to authors, who then make those changes and send them back to editors. And it doesn't always have to be just authors and editors. It could be, could be your professor, right? So it could be you and your professor. It could be two colleagues who are kind of providing that feedback to each other. So just because it says authors and editors, that can mean a whole lot of things. And that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation. That kind of hopefully we kind of tied together from start to finish, what effective feedback is, and how to not only give but also take effective feedback, and then kind of tie that into the actual research process that you might have if you were, let's say, working in a lab or maybe an independent project. So if you have any questions about the workshop that we had today, or just in general about the research process, we're UNC Journey. We can definitely give advice on other aspects of the research process. If you have any questions on those, please feel free to put those in the chat. And just
also feel free to share some of your own like experiences with giving and receiving feedback. We can talk about some of them, and like maybe if you receive feedback, and we could talk about how it made you feel, and like we just have an open discussion about feedback in general.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So definitely, we're going to be here for a couple more minutes after the, after this meeting. So please feel free to put anything in the chat, or if you want to unmute, you can do that as well. Make sure also, if you don't have any more questions, to scan the QR code before you go. And as Riley said in the chat, make sure to check out UNC Journey. We have a lot of great stuff coming up. A couple more workshops coming in a few weeks. So if you really enjoyed this workshop, definitely make sure to check those out to help improve your research skills. So, yeah. Thank you, guys.